Well, as we see and hear in many parts of the Gospels, all four of the Gospels, not just Matthew, feeding people who are hungry and giving something to drink to people who are thirsty were big priorities for Jesus in his earthly ministry, and they're still big priorities for him. And he calls on all of his disciples to take part in the eating and the drinking, not only with each other, but also giving food to people who also need the food and giving them drinks. So this is part of the food ministries and caring for other people that Jesus has called us to do in every generation, including, of course, in our own time. Now, you may remember from a parable that's at the end of Matthew, close to the end, and this parable only is found in Matthew, none of the other Gospels. You remember that Jesus said to his disciples, if they gave food to someone who was hungry, or if they gave a cup of water or anything to drink to someone who was thirsty, they were also doing it to him. What a big thing that is to know in our own lifetime, that if we're doing something so little as helping people have their daily food and drink, that is part of doing something for Christ. And he said that we may be blessed by his Father and welcomed into God's kingdom, again, for the acts of giving people food and drink. Now, that parable, as I mentioned, only appears in Matthew. But one of the interesting things about what we heard today, this is unique in many cases, but this story of the feeding of the 5,000 men plus women and children appears in all four of the Gospels. Very rare that we have something that is in all four of them. Quite often the Gospel of John is doing something a little different with its narrative. And in every one of the four stories in the Gospels, there were always 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus does something with those loaves of bread and the fish, and he also involves his disciples in varying ways. And all of the crowds get fed. As we heard today, they were able to eat their fill, how much they wanted, how much they desired, how much they needed, and there was quite a bit left over afterwards. And this was left over from just how the abundance got generated. We don't really know. We don't know if it's an actual miracle or not, but the abundance of the fish and the bread that were distributed after Jesus did something with it, and we're going to talk about the blessing that he gave, and also how he involved his disciples into it, because it's very important that it involves us too. It's not just Jesus doing a miracle and having a feast for those 5,000 plus people. And clearly what he did in this story was very important to the gospel writers, for all four of them to put it in. And 2 of the gospels, Matthew and Mark, they actually have a second story where he feeds 4,000 people plus, and so this is told in various ways 6 times across the gospels. And so this is a memorable thing, and it was deeply impactful on the early Christians as they were learning about it. But as we said again, he was in what was supposed to be a deserted place. That meant not necessarily that there weren't any people there, but evidently there weren't villages and places to buy things. And also there weren't any boat marinas on you can see in the picture, the boats must have just pulled up by themselves. And so this was deserted in the way that there weren't a lot of other people there besides the crowds and Jesus, and also not a lot of support services. And as we hear in the story, Jesus, in the beginning of the story, shows his first act of compassion and feeling of compassion, because when he saw the crowds, even though he wanted to be by himself, he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. And this particular word, compassion, in the New Testament has a specific meaning of being very, very deep. It's a feeling that people have inside that is also, it's in their belly area, not their heart, but this was the way it was conceived of then, and also felt, physically and spiritually. So it's a very deep empathy, and it was really gripping, it really took hold of Jesus. And here Jesus is doing that even though, he had heard of John the Baptist's death, and even though he wanted to be alone. And because of that compassion, we hear that Jesus took the time to cure all the people who were sick in that crowd that was joining him in that otherwise empty place. And then, as we heard, as the story develops, Jesus was moved again when the disciples came to him a few hours later and they said, "We're worried about the crowds. We don't know if they have any food, and it's almost nighttime." And they were thinking that Jesus should send them away to find food. But we can see, even though they don't use the word compassion again, you see Jesus having empathy again for those crowds, which are made up of men, women, and children. And you can see men, women, and children in this picture, too, on the cover. And he knew that there was no place for them to go. And so this is an empathy. We don't know where that empathy comes from, but you might want to remember that Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness when he fasted from food and drinking, and so he would have remembered being very, very hungry. And at the end, the angels came and tended to him. Or he could have also been hungry and thirsty at other times during his ministry. We know he had people supporting him. There were wealthy women who supported him, and he had a lot of meals, but it doesn't mean that he didn't go hungry or thirsty at different times, and he would remember that. But Jesus didn't agree with the disciples' proposed solution, again, that if they send them away, they can go to the villages and buy their food. And instead, he told the disciples these words that he still tells us today. He said, "You give them something to eat." I also think that Jesus showed a little bit of empathy for the disciples. He didn't just leave them on their own. He could have just said, "You go figure it out." But then he said, "Well, bring me what you have." And, they already knew that they had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So he did actually do this with him, which is another thing for us to remember. We're never really left on our own. And he took, and this is the thing I want us to hear, especially because today we're going to be doing communion together. He uses here the language that became part of the sacramental language of the Lord's Supper when he instituted that later, and then the way that the churches institute it. But hear this part. Jesus took the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, and he blessed and broke the bread, and he gave the bread and the fish to the disciples to give to the people. So there's the action of blessing the bread like we will do this morning. To make a little joke, I always have thought over the years it's a good thing that we don't have to grill the fish for the communion service, that, he went with the cup, the wine, and we do grape juice. Otherwise, we would be grilling up, bread, fish, wine, all on every Sunday for communion. But this turned into a sacred meal, and the idea that he involved the deacons, the disciples in distributing it, that's nowadays what we do. Pastors and deacons work together, as we will do today, and you come up here. Sometimes people are served in the pews, but you come here. But it's all a process of, Jesus. I'm not saying pastors are like Jesus, but, Jesus and the disciples did the distributing. Here we do pastors, deacons, and everybody else serving each other. And this becomes one of Jesus's first sacred meals. This is a sacramental meal with crowds of people that he might never have seen again. They may not be the same crowds when he moves to another place. There could be a different crowd there. So it's not as if they necessarily go with him from place to place. But he's got a sacred meal in a place that was supposed to be deserted, and it was not deserted because, first of all, he was there, and a lot of other people were there too, but he turned it into a sacramental meal, and that's one that we can remember when we do similar things together in our own ministries. And again, we already heard that people were able to eat what they wanted, and there was a lot left over. And we imagine, even if we know there's something miraculous here, we do essentially imagine that people really did have some food with them. The 5,000 people had some food. So the thought process is that as Jesus and the disciples were providing food, that people also shared some of what they had. And so the leftovers could have been a combination of what people brought and shared and what Jesus and the disciples were able to give to people. But I just wanted to say, and thinking, bridging to, our world today, there was really so much more there, not just the leftovers of the food and the meal, but so much there because the people had been in the presence of Jesus and evidently for several hours because they had come earlier and, people were cured, and then it became evening. And we see the other so much more than the physical bread and so much more than the physical fish, is that Jesus showed compassion and empathy for people. He wasn't just feeding them. He didn't leave anyone out, regardless of their income or anything, any aspect of their life. He didn't leave anyone on their own. He was fair in the sharing for everybody. And he must have, for just a night maybe, he's created that sense of community amongst the people, and perhaps he took that with him as he was going, something that meant something to him. And he left the disciples, the gospel writers, people today, he left us a story that we can think, what does it mean to us in our own sharing of food and drink in our world? I will share to you that quite often over the last couple of years, I hear Jesus' words about, you give them something to eat. I do like to follow the news sometimes. It's not always easy to follow, but I have been following news of food shortages in so many places, and famines and droughts. And then there's the shipping blockages for the grain from Ukraine and Russia. Third time now that we're going through this process of trying to get permission that the grain can be shipped. It's grain that already exists that people need to eat in other places, and it's being blocked again. We hear about people going hungry in our own country, our own communities, as well as, other places in the world. And today, you probably know this, but even though this is partly something that happens from year to year, it's severe hunger and famine in East Africa or the Horn of Africa, in several countries there. These are literal deserts and deserted places now, and when you see the photos, you see animals that have died, livestock animals, and people and animals are suffering, and some of the areas that they're in are also experiencing conflicts or sometimes a full-out war, and these can become deserted places not just because of the droughts, but also if we abandon them, if we don't care about people in these other countries, then the rest of the world might be deserting them. There's also some parts of Ukraine, especially last year, they may have been receiving more aid now, but the heavily damaged areas in Ukraine, often the wildlife were suffering as well, and the land suffered, and the land wasn't really able to produce anymore. So there's a lot of need there for the people who are still living in Ukraine. And again, it can become a desert place literally, and it also could become deserted if other people are not involved in helping. And then the final example I have on the idea of a desert or a deserted place is here in our country. There are places, and Hartford used to be one of them, that are referred to figuratively as food deserts. And these are often urban areas where the poverty level is high, and there's no grocery stores there. The big grocery stores that most of us are used to going into, some big grocery store, and you walk in and then you see the produce. And they don't have access in some of these places. The people who live there don't have the access to go and get fresh fruit or vegetables or milk, the wholesome things that we need, and they have to go to little shops that maybe they can walk to, or they can take a bus, or they're in the neighborhood. But some of these cities are now, obviously the bigger grocery stores are going in, because otherwise it's the discrimination of a high type. And there's many organizations working on this, but I was surprised when I was thinking more about this, that even as recently as 2017, and that was before the pandemic, but there was a sizable percentage of the population in the US that were deemed to live in a food desert. And then just locally, we know that our food banks and our food pantries go through times of need for more food and drink, and that can be cyclical, or it can be because of an event like the pandemic. And I really think in all the churches I've served, as well as the ones I visit, I think one of our strengths in our congregations is our food ministries, and we're resilient. So when the things needed to be done differently in the pandemic to be healthy, safe delivery and all of that, people found ways to collect food, give food, deliver food safely. And so I suggest, I don't have an answer, I don't have the solutions, but I do suggest, as the new situations are here now, especially at the global level where it's a little bit harder to help people, I do think that the churches and other faith people and people of goodwill, we can find solutions so that nobody is left deserted in a deserted place and that there aren't things like food deserts. And I would just say, as we do look to what we can continue to do in our ministries, we always see how Jesus does feed people. He feeds us during other people's and our own times of physical hunger and thirst, and he feeds us in times of our spiritual emptiness. And he also is with us, even if he says, you need to do it yourself. He doesn't expect us really to do it without him. So he doesn't leave us just like those other disciples with just figuring out how to feed so many people. And as we also trust and know, Jesus is always with us at all times. This is in all places that might seem like deserts or deserted places to us, but they're never deserted. And they're never left alone, because of Jesus' presence with all the people in all the world in any time and any place. Amen.